They said I was too dramatic for the truth, so I showed them the proof. They always said I was too much, too loud, too sensitive, too intense, too inquisitive for a family that preferred silence over substance. Dramatic, they'd mutter like it was a curse word, like it was a disease they all hoped I'd grow out of. I remember sitting at the edge of my uncle's pristine dining room table, hands trembling beneath the thick linen cloth that hung too low, brushing against my knees, while everyone else laughed at a joke I didn't hear because I was too focused on the hushed conversation between my mother and Aunt Lillian, one that paused the second I turned my head. It wasn't the words I heard, but the sudden absence of them. And in that vacuum, I became the enemy, the eavesdropper, the one who never knew how to let things go. They never admitted anything, not even when their lies started tripping over each other. My mother would shut her eyes tightly whenever I asked too many questions, as if erasing me from sight could silence the ones clawing their way out of her past. She'd shake her head and say, "Don't start again, Celia. You're reading too much into things. That's your problem. You always have." That line was their favorite, a tired phrase passed between relatives like an heirloom, wielded like a shield to block whatever inconvenient truth I was chasing at the time. I grew up with suspicion coiled inside me like a second spine, unable to relax, to breathe fully, because I could sense it. The rot. The thick, sour stench of secrets buried in plain sight, lacquered over with civility, and the hollow rituals of family dinners and Christmas cards. It began with the photo, an unassuming curled-edged snapshot I found tucked between the pages of one of my father's old books. A candid of my mother, arms wrapped around a man I didn't recognize, eyes not just happy but radiant in a way I'd never seen in any of our family albums. There was no date on the back, no inscription, just the image of something realer than any memory I'd ever been allowed to keep. I brought it to her, of course. I was 23 then, far too old to be scolded like a child, but she looked at me like I'd dragged a corpse into her living room. "Where did you find this?" she asked, voice brittle, as though even acknowledging its existence risked shattering the fragile mask she wore. I asked who the man was. She told me he was no one. And when I didn't accept that answer, when I pressed, calmly, logically, with all the self-restraint I could summon, she called me unwell, said I needed help, said I was obsessing again, that I was creating chaos because I didn't know how to be happy. "You always do this," she sighed, like I was nothing more than a malfunctioning part of her otherwise perfect life. "You make things up when there's nothing wrong." But there was something wrong. There had always been something wrong. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just walked out of her house, photo still clutched in my pocket, and drove back to my tiny apartment where the walls were bare and the fridge mostly empty, but where at least I could breathe without inhaling lies. It wasn't the photo that broke me. It was her reaction, that brittle fear in her voice. Not anger, not annoyance, but fear. She was scared I had found it, which meant it mattered, which meant I was right to be suspicious all along. That night, I spread out everything I had ever collected, the emails, the receipts, the old letters I had found hidden in a shoebox beneath my father's tool bench after his funeral. They were like puzzle pieces that never quite fit, until suddenly, they did. My father had died a decade earlier, and ever since my mother had worn grief like a cloak. But as I went through those letters, cross-referencing names, dates, locations, one thing became agonizingly clear. She had been planning to leave him. Not just planning, she had already left, at least emotionally, if not legally. The man in the photo was named Robert Langley, and according to a few strategically pulled tax records and a public records request, he had been renting a small house in Hudsonville, less than 20 miles from where I grew up, during the final 3 years of my father's life. The letters weren't love notes. They were plans, financial documents, shared investments, conversations about what to do with Celia when the time came. That's how she referred to me, not as her daughter, but as a variable, a problem to be solved. I didn't sleep for days. When I confronted her again, she denied everything, claimed the letters were fake, that I was unstable, that I was doing this again. The phrase was practically tattooed on her tongue by then. I told her I could get the ink on the documents analyzed, verify their authenticity. She didn't say another word after that, just stared at me, lips parted like a wound, and I knew in that silence that I had won something, even if I didn't yet know what it was. But it wasn't just my mother. It never is it? Secrets don't survive in a vacuum. They thrive in collusion. My older cousin Jared, the golden boy with the perfect hair and gleaming law degree, was next. I called him, asked him if he remembered the time Uncle Malcolm said something about changing the will after the stroke. He laughed, tried to brush it off. Malcolm had half a brain at that point, Celia. Don't quote a dying man. But there was something nervous in his laugh, something twitchy and false. So I asked him, point blank, if he had ever seen the original will. The real one. The one written before the sudden revision that gave everything, every penny, every property, to him and Aunt Lillian, cutting out my mother entirely. I'm not entertaining your conspiracies, he snapped. But I hadn't accused him of anything. Not yet. That was when I knew he had something to hide. And so I did what I always do. I dug. I called the courthouse. I requested records. I found a clerk willing to meet me off the clock. I used my father's old storage unit key and uncovered files that hadn't seen daylight in years. The revised will was a forgery. A convincing one, but not infallible. The signature had been digitally traced from an old check. The notary had been dead for 5 years at the time. The will was supposedly signed. And the witness? A man named Stephen Carr, who turned out to be Jared's former college roommate. It was all so grotesquely sloppy, so audacious, as if they never imagined someone would care enough to look. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. I built my case like an architect builds a cathedral, slowly, painstakingly, with a kind of reverence for the truth they had tried to kill. I archived emails. I traced bank transfers. I matched handwriting samples and timelines. I hired a private investigator with the last of my savings. I let the truth rise like a tide while they slept, unaware that their reckoning was already unfolding. They called me dramatic, even then, when I stopped coming to family functions, when I stopped answering messages, when I moved cities without warning, changed my number, locked down my social media. They called me dramatic. Because what else could they call me that wouldn't require looking inward? When I sent out the invitations for the gathering, I used careful words, neutral ones. A celebration of legacy, a remembrance dinner. Most of them showed up in expensive shoes and silk blouses, expecting tea and charcuterie and a slideshow of old photos. What they got instead was a projector, a USB drive, and the slow, methodical unveiling of everything they thought they'd buried. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply showed them the proof, and watched the color drain from their faces. The silence that followed the last slide was heavier than any scream I could have coaxed from them. For a moment, no one moved. The room, once brimming with the hollow clatter of polite conversation and carefully modulated laughter, had become a mausoleum of open mouths and widened eyes. Aunt Lillian sat rigid, her manicured fingers clenched around the stem of her tea glass, as though the fragile crystal could tether her to the illusion that everything was still as it had been before the lights dimmed. Jared was the first to speak, if a guttural, strangled scoff could be considered speech. "This is a stunt," he managed, jaw tight, voice hoarse with disbelief he was struggling to disguise as disdain. "You're twisting things, Celia. That will was verified. That notary was legitimate. You're manipulating facts to fit some twisted narrative because you've always resented me." I leaned against the table, the dull metal of my USB still warm from the projector port, my pulse thunderous but controlled. "You know what's funny?" I said, my voice calm, almost curious. Every time I brought up inconsistencies, every time I asked questions, I was told I was imagining things. Now that I've laid everything out, chronologically, legally, verifiably, suddenly I'm manipulative. I gestured toward the still image on the screen, a scanned copy of the signature comparison, overlaid in forensic ink analysis, the falsification glaring to anyone with eyes. "There's nothing to twist here. You made a copy. You falsified a witness. You stole an inheritance." Gasps erupted in the far end of the room, not because of the revelation. Most had already absorbed that, but because of the naming. The crime had been uttered aloud, stated plainly, not euphemized with vague references to mistakes or misunderstandings. I had learned through years of emotional neglect that the real taboo in our family wasn't lying. It was acknowledging the lie after it had been exposed. Jared's face blanched with the realization that his power, the unspoken agreement of silence that insulated him, had been punctured, and not just in private, but in a room full of relatives, many of whom had always been too careful to pick a side. "Why are you doing this?" my cousin Marissa asked, her voice wobbling with an almost childish bewilderment. "You could have just come to us privately. We're family." "Privately?" I repeated, blinking slowly, trying to keep the heat in my chest from rushing into my voice. Privately was how I begged for the truth 10 years ago. Privately was how I asked my mother to explain that photo. Privately was how I asked what happened to the money my father had set aside for me in his accounts. Privately I was gaslit and dismissed and called unstable. Privately was how you all told me to shut up and move on. So no, Marissa, I don't do privately anymore. From the other side of the room, Aunt Lillian rose with all the grace of a woman used to commanding attention at weddings and wakes alike. Her voice, when it came, was frigid and elegant, as though she were reciting from a script drafted long before this moment ever arrived. "This doesn't have to destroy everything, Celia," she said, as if she were offering an olive branch and not a veiled threat. "There's a way through this, a dignified way. If you think you've uncovered something inappropriate, then fine. Let's look into it. Discreetly. There's no reason for all this spectacle. You're clearly angry, and I can understand that. But you're not seeing the big picture." I didn't laugh, though it would have been deserved. "I see the big picture just fine," I said. "It's painted in stolen ink and forged signatures, and it's framed by the kind of entitlement only people like you could mistake for dignity." I turned then, not just toward her but toward the entire room, sweeping my gaze across the faces that had so often blurred into one another in my childhood. Blandly supportive at birthdays, stiffly courteous at graduations, all united by a shared compulsion to ignore anything that disrupted the family's curated image. "You all said I was dramatic. Do you remember that? When I said something was wrong, when I pointed out that timelines didn't make sense, that wills don't rewrite themselves, that money doesn't just evaporate, you told me I was unwell, over-emotional, hysterical. I let the word linger like a foul taste. You told me to get therapy, not answers. You said I needed healing, not justice. An older relative, my great-aunt Ruth, whom I barely remembered speaking to me as a child, whispered something into her husband's ear and rose to leave. I didn't stop her. This wasn't a plea for acceptance. It was a reckoning, and those unready to witness it were free to slip out the back door and rejoin the comforting narrative of my supposed instability. But not all of them moved. A few remained, frozen in their seats, unwilling to flee, but clearly uncertain of their place now that the myth had been dismantled. "Celia," a voice said softly, and it took me a moment to recognize it as my younger cousin Chloe. She had been a child when all this began, a quiet shadow at the periphery of family events, her eyes always watchful. "If all this is true, what happens now?" The question hung like smoke. I had thought of it endlessly in the months leading up to this night. What happens after the truth? Does the world fall apart? Do the guilty apologize? Do reparations begin? Do new lies emerge, cobbled together hastily to cover the old ones? But I didn't have an answer that would satisfy them. Not yet, because the next part wasn't about satisfying. It was about seeing how far they were willing to go to pretend nothing had happened. "That depends," I said finally, voice measured, "on whether they're more interested in saving face or setting things right." I left them with that. I unplugged the USB, packed up the projector, walked out of the banquet hall without a single backward glance. No one followed me. That, more than anything, told me everything I needed to know. The calls started the next morning. First Jared, then Lillian, then my mother. None of them called to apologize. The word never even passed their lips. What they wanted was clarification, damage control. They wanted to know what I planned to do with the documents, if I intended to go public, if I'd already contacted an attorney. They couched their panic in vague reassurances. "Let's work through this as a family. We're willing to have a conversation. You've made your point. Let's not escalate things." But none of them showed the kind of remorse that even hinted at genuine accountability. I didn't answer right away. I let the voicemails pile up. I watched their desperation grow as the silence stretched, each new message more urgent than the last. That was when I realized something vital. For the first time, they were afraid of me. Not because I had power exactly, but because I had stripped them of theirs. The power they once held, the ability to dismiss, to gaslight, to deny, no longer worked. Their words had become hollow. Their narratives collapsed under the weight of facts they couldn't refute. And in their panic, they revealed themselves, not as protectors of family honor, but as architects of a crumbling deception. Still, I didn't act immediately. Instead, I studied them, watched how they squirmed, took notes on the lengths they would go to preserve their reputations. Jared offered me a financial settlement to move on. Aunt Lillian proposed a rewrite of the will to better reflect fairness. My mother, my mother, sent a handwritten letter, tear-stained and disjointed, saying she had been trapped, that she had only gone along with things because she feared losing what little security she had left. She said she loved me, that she always had, that I didn't understand the kind of pressure she had been under. But she was wrong. I understood perfectly. I understood that fear and greed often wear the same face. I understood that survival can look like complicity when it's dressed up in pearls and self-pity. I understood that her love had always been conditional, tied to my silence, to my compliance, to my ability to play the grateful daughter while they built their little empire on bones and lies. So I didn't answer their calls. I didn't reply to their emails. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I compiled everything. Not just the documents from the will, but the tax fraud, the asset transfers, the forged insurance forms, the shell companies, the off-the-books properties. The web was larger than I had initially realized, and the deeper I looked, the more grotesque it became. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a criminal operation disguised as generational wealth, and I had it all. The question wasn't whether I could destroy them. It was whether I should. They were already unraveling. Jared's law firm, once pristine, had begun leaking rumors. Aunt Lillian's charity work was being re-examined. The whispers had started, and none of them knew how loud they would grow. The story wasn't public yet, but in their world, where image was everything, rumors were blood in the water. I had always thought that vindication would taste sweet, that when the truth finally came to light, I'd feel powerful, triumphant. But what I felt was colder, sharper, something closer to inevitability than joy. I had forced them to see me not as a liability, not as a fragile embarrassment, but as a threat. And now they wanted to broker peace with someone they had spent a lifetime undermining. The choice ahead of me wasn't about revenge. It was about consequence. Could I walk away, knowing they would do this again to someone else? Or was it my responsibility to finish what I started? I didn't know yet, but I was getting closer to the answer. There is a peculiar stillness that arrives when you've taken control of a narrative long denied to you. A silence that hums not with peace, but with the quiet recoil of power-shifting hands. I sat in my apartment that night with the blinds drawn and the documents spread before me like a kingdom forged from paper and ink, and all I could think about was how deeply quiet everything had become. The noise, the relentless denials, the interruptions, the gaslighting refrains, had ceased, not because they finally understood, but because I had left them no room for rebuttal. They were scrambling in back rooms and whispered conference calls now, frightened of what would happen if I chose to speak again, this time to someone with a badge, a byline, or a bench. And yet, despite the victory of the moment, there was no triumph in my chest, no swelling of satisfaction. There was only the pulsing weight of decision, dragging behind my ribcage like an anchor. I had options now, more than they'd ever thought I would, and each one shimmered with a different brand of retribution. I could go to the police with the forged will, the fraud, the signatures, the property theft. I could take it to the press and watch their reputations wither in real time as the carefully composed facade of decency crumbled under the floodlights of public scrutiny. Or I could do what they were all so desperately begging me to do, keep it quiet, accept their offers, let them bleed out privately behind locked doors while the rest of the world continued to believe they were who they pretended to be. But what none of them understood even now was that this wasn't just about punishment. It was about truth. It was about undoing a lifetime of being the one who had to carry the silence so others could remain comfortable in their lies. The world outside my window was muted by the spring rain that had begun to fall, fat drops striking the sill like fingers tapping to be let in. I stared at the evidence again, flipping through the files with a precision obsession. Here was the amended will, notarized by a man whose signature had been certified on documents dated 2 years after his death. Here were the bank transactions, hundreds of them, moving funds between LLCs that had no real employees and post office boxes masquerading as offices. Here was the property deed for a condo registered under an alias Aunt Lillian had once used when she served on the board of a nonprofit. And here were the photographs of that same condo being rented on a short-term lease site, the income never declared, the address never mentioned in any family meeting. Layer after layer of deception, all of it balanced delicately atop the assumption that no one would look too closely, that no one would dig. And then, amid the records, I found it. The final piece I hadn't known I was missing. A scanned document filed with a municipal court 7 years ago, referencing a trust fund established in my name by my father, one I had never seen a cent from. My breath caught as I leaned closer. The trust had been intended to mature when I turned 25, with a clause that allowed early access for educational purposes. It was substantial. Not generational wealth substantial, but enough to buy a house, start a business, or disappear entirely. And it had been emptied 2 months before my 24th birthday. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. I just sat there perfectly still as the final knot unraveled and the truth lay bare before me. They hadn't just lied. They hadn't just covered up an affair or doctored a will. They had stolen from me, directly, intentionally, with documentation. My name had been forged on a withdrawal form, my signature sloppily mimicked by someone who clearly hadn't realized I dotted my I's with a slight curve. The account had been drained, and the money rerouted through an intermediary holding company, one that, after a few more clicks, I traced back to an attorney's office where Jared had once interned. My hands trembled slightly, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical clarity of betrayal quantified. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about theft, fraud, a felony. And every trace of it was mine to wield. I called no one. I went to sleep that night with the document beneath my pillow, not out of sentimentality but necessity. Trust had become an antiquated relic in my world. There were no allies now, only variables. The next morning, I rose early and drove 2 hours out of town to a law office I had researched obsessively for weeks. They specialized in fiduciary fraud and estate theft, and more importantly, they were discreet. I met with a partner named Helena, a woman with eyes like razors and a reputation for dismantling even the most entrenched family estates with surgical efficiency. She said little as I laid everything before her. The documents, the recordings, the digital files. She didn't gasp, didn't ask incredulous questions. She just nodded, a slow, predatory gleam building in her eyes as the scope of the case expanded with each new piece of evidence. "You have enough here to file both civil and criminal charges," she said finally, her voice as calm as a storm cloud before the break. "The theft alone, particularly from the trust fund, is actionable immediately. We'd have to subpoena the banks and push through discovery, but with your evidence, they'll settle fast. They'll want to keep this out of court." I said nothing, just nodded. She leaned back in her chair, lacing her fingers. "But I should warn you," she added, her tone softening just a fraction. "Once this starts, there's no turning back. The case will move. The names will come out. This will not stay contained." I understood what she meant. The decision wasn't about money. It was about war. And once declared, it would consume everything. There would be no more family reunions, no more polite avoidance at weddings, no more passive-aggressive texts from cousins pretending they didn't pick a side. There would only be scorched earth. But hadn't that already happened? Hadn't they already made that choice when they wrote me off as hysterical, when they forged documents in my name, when they lied to my face and called it concern? I retained Helena that day. The lawsuit was drafted within a week. When the cease and desist letters hit their doors, the panic turned frantic. The calls resumed, more frequent, more insistent. My mother left 17 voicemails in 3 days, her voice deteriorating from composed pleading to breathless begging. Jared showed up outside my building, standing in the rain with the same arrogance he'd once used to win courtroom settlements, now reduced to a wet and desperate man clutching a leather briefcase that surely held some hastily prepared bribe. I didn't let him in. But I watched how he paced, how his face contorted when I didn't respond, how the mask cracked just enough to reveal the rot beneath. He stood there for over an hour before finally walking away, drenched and defeated. It should have made me feel powerful, but all I felt was tired. The court filings became public record the following week. I didn't speak to the press, but someone did, perhaps a clerk or a paralegal with too much curiosity and too little discretion. The story hit the local paper first. Family estate dispute reveals allegations of forgery, fraud. The names were there, the dates, the figures. It was dry, clinical, and damning. From there, it spread. Social media did what social media does, dissecting the story with a cruelty and fervor that no courtroom could match. Suddenly, I wasn't just the dramatic cousin anymore. I was the whistleblower, the truth teller, the woman who dared to drag the family skeletons into the light and name each bone aloud. They tried to push back, a statement from Jared's lawyer, a vague press release from Aunt Lillian's nonprofit, whispers that I was mentally unstable, emotionally unwell, driven by vengeance. But it was too late. The paper trail I had built was too detailed, too irrefutable. They could smear my name all they wanted. It wouldn't change the dates on the forged documents or the withdrawals from the trust. And yet, amid all the noise, what haunted me most wasn't their attempts at defense. It was the silence from my mother. After that last flurry of voicemails, she had vanished. No more calls, no emails, no letters, just absence. And in that quiet, I began to realize the truth I hadn't wanted to face. She wasn't silent because she was ashamed. She was silent because she had chosen a side. And it wasn't mine. There is a strange kind of loneliness that settles over you when you become the mirror no one wants to look into. A loneliness that is not quiet or passive, but vibrating, electric, alive with the knowledge that you've finally become undeniable. The moment the article went viral, I felt the weight of that truth press against my skin, like heat rising from asphalt, as if every word printed about the family I had spent my life orbiting was a flare I had lit, knowing it would burn, knowing it would sear more than just the guilty. I sat in the corner of my small, clean apartment, the only place that still felt mine, as the world reacted. My inbox flooded with messages from journalists, lawyers, even former friends I hadn't heard from in years, some reaching out with concern, some with curiosity, and many more with opportunism dressed up as sympathy. I read each message like a forensic specialist examining bones, looking for the fracture lines that would tell me who had ever truly seen me, and who had only ever seen a version of me that served their story. But perhaps most jarring were the messages from strangers, people who had never known my name until it was attached to scandal. They wrote to me from places I had never been, recounting their own betrayals, their own unheeded warnings and ignored truths, weaving a tapestry of shared experience that stretched across states, borders, cultures. Each one of them, in their own quiet desperation, had once been the dramatic one, and each of them had been forced to choose between silence and survival. Some had picked the former. Others had learned, like I had, that sometimes the only way out is through the fire. Their words didn't comfort me, exactly, but they grounded me in the reality that my story was no longer just mine. It had grown legs, a voice, a pulse. It was becoming something larger, something uncontainable. And the thing I had once been shamed for, my refusal to shut up, my insatiable need to understand, had become power. But power, I was learning, was never without cost. The legal proceedings advanced quickly, because there was nothing they could delay without implicating themselves further. Jared's attorney requested a mediation meeting, a final attempt to settle before it went to court. Helena advised me not to agree, warned me they were hoping to coerce me with performative regret and strategic tears. But I said yes anyway. Not because I believed they could redeem themselves, not because I wanted closure. I said yes because I wanted to look them in the eye and watch them squirm under the weight of the lies they had so carefully constructed, lies they had forced me to carry for years, while painting me as unstable, unhinged, ungrateful. I didn't want their apology. I wanted their discomfort. I wanted their shame to have a face, and a sound, and a color. The mediation took place in a sterile downtown office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a skyline too clean to match the filth being discussed inside. They arrived as a unit, still pretending to be cohesive, though their eyes told a different story, shifty, fragmented, each one blaming the other in the privacy of their own mind. Jared was first through the door, dressed in a suit that cost more than my rent, and exuding the false humility of a man who thought charm could still save him. Aunt Lillian followed, her usually immaculate appearance dulled by a lack of sleep and panic not yet processed. My mother was last. She didn't look at me. Not once. She sat across the table, eyes fixed on some point behind my head, and I understood that her silence hadn't been a temporary retreat. It had been a final abandonment. Their lawyer opened with a predictably saccharine statement, acknowledging misunderstandings and expressing hope that we could resolve this as a family. Helena didn't flinch. She laid out the facts in a voice so measured it could have been broadcast. She walked them through the timeline of the trust fund theft, the forged will, the shell companies. She didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. When she finished, the room fell into a silence so thick I could feel the oxygen stretch to accommodate it. That's when Jared leaned forward. He didn't apologize. Of course he didn't. Men like him don't understand the concept. They only understand leverage. "You've made your point," he said, the false magnanimity dripping from his tone like sap. "We get it. You're angry. You wanted to prove we were wrong about you. And you did. But this..." He gestured to the documents, the allegations, the looming legal consequences. "This helps no one. Not really. You think you're winning, but what happens after? The money doesn't bring peace. You'll still be alone. Is that what you want?" I stared at him, wondering how a man so intelligent could be so completely stupid. "You think this is about money," I said, my voice low and level, "because money is all you've ever cared about. But you stole from me. You stole time, opportunity, safety. You stole my dignity and replaced it with doubt. And now that I've taken it back, you're still trying to negotiate. You want mercy, but you don't get to ask for that from me. Not now." He looked away, jaw tightening. Aunt Lillian tried next. She offered some clumsy anecdote about grief, about how people do irrational things when they're mourning, about how none of this was personal. "You have to understand," she said, placing her hand on her chest as though invoking emotion would restore credibility. "We were trying to protect you. The truth was too complicated." "Protect me?" I echoed. "By forging my name on documents and stealing my future?" "It was never meant to go that far," she whispered. "But it did," I said. "It did, and now you don't get to decide what's too far." Finally, my mother spoke. Not to me, but about me, as though I were a guest in the room and not its detonator. "She's always been like this," she said to no one in particular. "Always so intense, so emotional. You give her an inch and she turns it into a war." And there it was, the narrative. The ancient, threadbare storyline they had clung to like a security blanket. That I was the problem. That I was too dramatic, too obsessive, too unwilling to let things go. It wasn't new, but it still sliced through me like paper cuts too numerous to name. They weren't here to take responsibility. They were here to reassert the illusion that I was unstable, that this eruption was not the result of years of pressure, but simply a byproduct of my defective personality. I stood. Helena made a motion to continue, to sit back down, to maintain composure, but I shook my head. "We're done here," I said. "The offer is revoked. We go to court." The silence that followed was not stunned. It was resigned, because they knew. They had always known, somewhere deep in the rot of their conscience, that this day would come. They had simply believed they could outrun it. They couldn't. As we left the room, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what I would see, a family unraveling in real time, held together only by the last shreds of pretense, and the dawning awareness that their secrets had lost their sanctuary. The weeks that followed moved both too fast and achingly slow. Every hearing brought new revelations, emails uncovered, depositions that twisted the knife deeper. The prosecution began to circle, not just around Jared and Lillian, but others as well. Cousins who had accepted gifts from the estate, uncles who had signed off on questionable financial decisions. Each layer peeled back revealed another beneath it, like a Russian doll of corruption. It became clear that this wasn't just a matter of greed. It was a culture, an ecosystem built on the unspoken understanding that truth was malleable, and loyalty was only as deep as the secret you were willing to keep. The world watched, and I watched the world watching. Some nights I stood on my balcony, city lights stretching beneath me like veins, and wondered who I had become. I didn't recognize the girl I had once been, the one who whispered her suspicions into her pillow at night, afraid that even the walls might mock her. That version of me had been buried alongside the last shred of their credibility, and in her place stood someone else, not unscathed, not untouched, but unyielding. I hadn't burned the house down. I had simply opened the door and let the light in. And they, once so confident in their silence, were now the ones hiding in shadows, praying I wouldn't speak again. There is a moment near the end of any long storm where the wind dies down, not in relief, but in resignation. It's the hush that arrives after too much has already been destroyed to matter, a stillness that doesn't promise peace, only aftermath. I sat in the back of the courtroom as the final judgment was read, not because I needed the validation, but because I had earned the right to witness every second of what came next. The judge's voice echoed like a bell through the chamber, clear and final, naming the charges, the fines, the restitution. There were no outbursts, no shocked gasps or cries of protest. Just silence, heavy and bone deep, as my mother, Jared, and Lillian each absorbed the reality of what had come for them at last. There would be no more deals, no more whispers in dark hallways. The system they had manipulated so comfortably had turned its gaze, and it had not blinked. Jared had been disbarred 2 weeks prior. The footage of him leaving the disciplinary hearing, his hands trembling as he tried to maintain composure for the reporters swarming the steps, played on every local news station for 3 days straight. Aunt Lillian had resigned from the nonprofit in disgrace, her resignation letter a nauseating blend of deflection and hollow apology. Her properties were frozen pending investigation into the offshore accounts we had traced with painstaking precision. And my mother, well, her punishment wasn't a courtroom verdict or a financial penalty. Hers was quieter. Hers was the shattering of every illusion she had built around the idea that appearances could shield her from accountability. When the judge announced the restitution for the stolen trust fund, I didn't react. I had already known. The amount was more than symbolic, yet it wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that they had to give it back, that the thing they thought they had taken permanently was now not just returned, but marked forever with the evidence of their deceit. Helena turned to me after the ruling, her eyes meeting mine with something that looked like pride, though she said nothing. She didn't need to. We had won, completely, irrevocably. The weeks that followed felt strange, almost disembodied, as if my body were moving faster than my mind could catch up. People stopped me in grocery stores. They asked for interviews. Some even sent gifts, handwritten letters from strangers, thanking me for proving that persistence wasn't madness, that truth wasn't delusion. I accepted the letters and ignored the invitations. The story was over, but the performance could never resume. I didn't owe them my pain repackaged for consumption. I had already paid too high a price in silence. One afternoon, several weeks after the final hearing, I returned to the house. Not my apartment. The house. The one I had grown up in. The one with the peeling porch paint and the ivy that climbed too high along the back wall. I hadn't set foot inside it since before the suit began. It stood empty now, vacated under court order. The ownership quietly returned to me as part of the restitution. The place was unrecognizable in its quiet, stripped of its occupants and their projections. What remained was just wood, drywall, and echoes. I walked slowly from room to room, touching surfaces as though reacquainting myself with a version of me that had lived there once, unaware of how deeply the roots of betrayal had run beneath the foundation. In the attic, I found a box, labeled only with my name in my father's handwriting. Inside were photo albums I hadn't seen in years, a collection of journals, and a sealed envelope. I opened it slowly, carefully, as though the act itself might rupture something. It contained a letter dated nearly 20 years earlier. My father's words, written in blocky, deliberate script, filled the page. He wrote about how proud he was of me even then, about how he knew I saw things that others chose to ignore, how he hoped I wouldn't let the world dull that clarity. He acknowledged that some in the family operated on shadows, and that I might one day be forced to confront those shadows myself. If that day comes, he wrote, trust yourself, even if no one else does, especially then. The paper shook slightly in my hands, but I didn't cry. I wasn't mourning. I was remembering. And remembering, finally, felt like power. I took only that letter and one photo album when I left the house. The rest, I donated. The house sold in a matter of weeks. I made no announcement, no farewell post, no triumphant declaration. Just a quiet transfer of ownership, a passing of keys, and then I let it go. Because the house, like the people who had occupied it, no longer held any claim to my present. Helena called one morning with the final settlement figures. The trust was restored in full, with interest. Additional damages had been awarded in the civil suit, enough to secure whatever future I chose next. I thanked her, then asked that she close the file. Not out of fatigue, but finality. The war was over. There was no second wave coming, no more secrets waiting to be unearthed. Every thread had been pulled, every lie exposed. The story was truly finished. I spent the next few months rebuilding, not my reputation, because that had never been mine to destroy, but my sense of safety, of ownership over my own narrative. I moved across the country to a city where no one knew my name. I started small, a second-hand bookstore on a quiet corner with ivy-covered windows and enough foot traffic to keep me grounded. I spent my days surrounded by stories, the kind that didn't demand anything from me but attention. At night, I walked the streets without fear of seeing a familiar face or hearing my name whispered in pity or condemnation. One evening, a young woman came into the store, clutching a weathered copy of a memoir about surviving family betrayal. She lingered near the counter, unsure. Finally, she asked if I was the person from the article, the one who'd exposed her family, the one who'd won. I looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Her shoulders dropped in relief, as though just knowing I existed made her feel less alone. She didn't ask for advice. She just said, "Thank you," and left. That was all I needed. In time, the buzz faded. The public moved on. My name became one of those odd trivia facts people recalled only when similar stories surfaced. And I was fine with that. I had never wanted the spotlight. I had only ever wanted to be heard, to be believed, to reclaim what had been stolen, and to name what had always been true. I kept the letter from my father in a small frame beside my bed, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that the truth, no matter how inconvenient or painful, is never too dramatic. That survival is not silence, and that vindication doesn't always look like applause. Sometimes it looks like peace. And finally, after all the voices, the denials, the betrayals, the long walk through fire, I had it. Perfect. Absolute. Mine.